the silent fury of a broken life. Virginia Doyle had long ago given up any illusions of marital bliss. What had started as a dreamy union back in the mid-90s had quickly spiraled into a nightmare, one day at a time. Living in a creaky one-story home in the quiet but working-class suburbs of Chicago, Virginia could feel the walls closing in on her. Not just the physical walls that Richard, her husband, had filled over time with the smell of stale beer and the sound of shouting, but the invisible walls of control, despair and fear that she'd lived under for the last 2 decades. Richard Doyle wasn't always the monster he turned out to be. He had once been the man with the charming smile, the man who could fix anything around the house and win everyone over at family barbecues. But somewhere along the way, and Virginia couldn't pinpoint exactly when, his love for her turned into a need to dominate her. Maybe it was when he started gambling seriously, maybe it was when the whiskey bottle began disappearing faster on the kitchen counter, or maybe it was when the debt sharks started calling their house on a weekly basis. Virginia always wondered if the man she married had ever really existed at all, or if she had truly been blinded by the false promises of love. "You're not going anywhere, Ginny," Richard had hissed at her countless times over the years, a warning laced with venom whenever she brought up her unhappiness. Each time she tried to speak up or push back, his escalating anger reminded her what was at stake. A bruised arm or a shattered plate was nothing compared to the icy promise in his glare. He could hurt more if he wanted to, and she knew it. But even worse than the shouting, the occasional physical blows, was the psychological toll. "You'd be nothing without me," Richard had sneered on nights when he'd come home late from a losing streak at the casino. His voice would snake around the room as if he enjoyed the sound of her silence, the way she shriveled just to keep him from getting too enraged. She worked a thankless job as a part-time janitor at the local grocery store, not because she wanted to, but because Richard's gambling debts constantly drained whatever small savings they could manage. Every paycheck she made went to either food for the house or the creditors that Richard swore he'd settle someday. And the lies. Oh, the lies. Richard would promise change after every episode. "It won't happen again, Ginny," he'd whisper in the mornings when his rage had dissolved into apologies over eggs and coffee. "I'll lay off the drink, I'll cut back the poker games, baby, you know I love you." And despite knowing in her heart how repetitive this cycle was, Virginia would believe him because leaving wasn't as easy as it sounded. Where would she go? How would she survive? Who would even believe her? The judgment of the neighbors weighed down on her too. The Doyle family home, with its peeling paint and overgrown weeds, stood out like a sore thumb in a neighborhood that otherwise had shining lawns and prideful homeowners. Everyone had whispers swirling about Ginny Doyle, the unlucky wife, or poor Richard Doyle dealing with his messes. People noticed her tired eyes when she came outside to fetch the mail, her long sleeves even on a hot summer's day, and the way she hurried back inside like a house cat too afraid to stray too far. They didn't, however, see much of Richard's darker side, his threats, his rage, or his need to remind Virginia that the entire world was against her too. And yet, there were moments when Virginia imagined breaking free. The thought flashed through her mind like a crack of lightning. She would be driving to and from work, rehearsing small decisions like whether she'd pack her things at night or grab her keys and run during the day when Richard was out. The freedom welled up in her as an idea, though it quickly withered. Richard had too tight a leash on her, both emotional and financial, and she couldn't bear the shame of what people might think of her if she ever managed to leave. Was she a coward for staying, or just practical? But as the years dragged on, the flame of defiance grew stronger in her chest, even if only flickering. She began recognizing the small ways in which her fury would bubble under the surface when Richard berated her. She started biting her tongue less and letting accusations slip out. "What if you didn't waste our life savings?" Or, "When's the last time you were sober enough to take care of anything?" Richard hated when she pushed back, and each confrontation ended in him yelling louder, reminding her of the hierarchy of their house. Yet through all those years of torment, Virginia waited for something. She didn't know what it was, her breaking point perhaps, or maybe just a day when the fear she had of Richard wasn't as strong as the anger festering deep in her heart. Either way, it was inevitable. And on the night of September 4th, 2012, that moment finally arrived. The breaking point. Death in the kitchen. The night of September 4th, 2012, started like many others for Virginia Doyle, but it ended like none before it. By that late summer evening, the house was unbearably quiet, except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan in the musty kitchen, and the occasional creak of footsteps outside. Virginia sat at the dining table, nursing her third cup of cold coffee. Her hands trembled as she absent-mindedly folded the corner of a stack of unpaid bills in front of her. Each piece of paper was like a weight pulling her deeper into despair, a bleak reminder of the life she never wanted but somehow could never leave. Richard came home late, stumbling through the door with the stench of whiskey and cigarettes clinging to him. Virginia could tell from the second he fumbled with his keys that it had been another bad night. The casino must have swallowed his last few dollars, as it often did. "Ginny, where are you? Get in here!" he bellowed, his voice already thick with drunken annoyance. Virginia stiffened in her chair. She had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing in her own home, moving quietly enough to avoid catching his attention when he was in a mood. But tonight, avoiding him wasn't an option. She was too tired, too angry, too drained to cower anymore. Richard staggered into the kitchen, his face red from the alcohol and frustration. His shirt was untucked, and a cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth. "You're sitting there doing nothing as usual," he snarled, leaning against the doorway for balance. Virginia didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. For a time, silence hung between them, a tense, electric silence that felt like the seconds before a storm breaks. "Don't ignore me," Richard growled, his tone growing sharper. "I'm talking to you." Finally, Virginia raised her eyes to meet his, her expression hollow. "What more can you want from me, Richard? There's nothing left to give. You've already taken it all." Her calmness only made him angrier. Richard slammed his hand against the dining table, causing her coffee cup to teeter dangerously before settling again. "Don't you dare play the victim, Ginny. If it weren't for me, where would you be, huh? Out on the streets?" Her heart raced, but she refused to look away. "Maybe I'd be better off there," she said quietly, almost to herself. Richard's face twisted into something predatory. He pushed the table roughly, knocking the bills onto the floor. "What the hell did you just say to me?" His voice echoed through the hollow house, as furious as it was desperate. It was at that moment Virginia realized something inside her had shifted permanently. For years she had absorbed his rage, his blame, his cruelty. But tonight, for the first time, she didn't feel scared. It was something darker, something primal. Richard grabbed her shoulder and yanked her up from the chair with such force that it tipped over onto the floor. Virginia stumbled but managed to stay on her feet. His grip was iron, his breath hot and sour on her face. "You think you can disrespect me? After everything I've done for you?" "Done for me?" she spat, her voice sharper than intended. "You've ruined me! You've ruined us! And you dare—" Before she could finish, his hand jerked up to her throat. His fingers wrapped tightly around her neck, and he shoved her against the kitchen counter. Instinctively, her hands grabbed at his arm, but he was too strong. Virginia's mind raced. This wasn't the first time he'd been violent, but tonight felt different. His eyes were bloodshot, his face contorted with something unhinged, a dangerous combination of failure, frustration, and unchecked fury. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she struggled against his grip, her vision blurred. Her surroundings, familiar and yet foreign, seemed to melt away. In her desperation, her hand fumbled blindly along the kitchen counter for anything she could grab. Her fingers brushed against the cold handle of a knife. Without hesitation, without a single thought of the consequences, she gripped it tightly. "Richard, let go, please," she gasped, her voice hoarse and cracking. He didn't. Instead, he sneered, leaning closer. "You're not going anywhere, Ginny. Ever." That was it. That was the moment. The years of abuse, the relentless cruelty, the shattered dreams, all of it boiled over in one explosive scream of pure defiance. With every ounce of strength left in her, Virginia raised the knife and drove it into Richard's chest. The blade sank in with terrifying ease, a sickening wet sound that hung in the air as Richard's grip abruptly loosened. He staggered back, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. "Ginny!" he choked, his voice faint and raspy. For a second they simply stared at one another, frozen in the surreal weight of what had just happened. Then he crumpled to the floor, his body landing heavily against the linoleum. Blood pooled beneath him, the rich crimson spreading like spilled paint. Virginia sank to her knees, her hands trembling, still clutching the knife. She couldn't move, she couldn't think. Only the sound of her ragged breathing filled the room, now unbearably quiet once again. Panic and the aftermath, hiding the crime. For a long while, Virginia knelt frozen on the linoleum floor of her kitchen, staring at the lifeless body in front of her. The knife was still in her hand, slick with blood, its weight icy and surreal. It felt as though time had stopped entirely. Richard Doyle, the man who controlled her every move, The man who had crushed her spirit for more than a decade was now nothing but a motionless heap, spilling crimson steadily across the floor. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe. "What have I done?" The question blared in her head like a siren, overpowering any coherent thought. Her heart pounded so fiercely it hurt, but her body remained locked in place. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the dripping faucet pierced through the suffocating silence of the room. The normalcy of those tiny sounds against the horror before her made the scene all the more unbearable. She clamped her hands over her ears for a moment, trying to block out not just the room but her spiraling panic. The next thought hit her like a thunderclap. "I'll go to prison." Her hands began to tremble violently, so much so that the knife slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor and sending fresh droplets of blood splattering onto her bare feet. The noise jolted her back to a semblance of reality. Whether it was the fear of arrest or some primal survival instinct acting as her guide, she knew one thing: no one can find out about this. For the first time in years, Virginia took control of a situation. Slowly, on shaky legs, she stood. Her eyes darted wildly around the kitchen. Pools of blood had already begun to soak into the seams of her cheap linoleum flooring. They would leave stains, proof if anyone were to come looking. Her gaze fell to Richard's body, lifeless and grotesque in unnatural stillness. She thought about calling the police, but the image of officers storming into her house, slapping handcuffs on her and taking her away in front of the neighbors, flashed vividly in her mind. What would they believe? That I was a battered wife, or that I was a murderer? The dagger-like whispers of doubt slithered through her mind. In the back of her mind, voices swirled, whispering all the things she'd read and heard over the years. Wives like her didn't win sympathy. They weren't seen as survivors, they were seen as criminals. "No one's going to believe me." Her voice wavered, barely more than a whisper in the suffocating room. She stumbled toward the sink and splashed cold water on her face, trying in vain to stop the rising tide of nausea. Her reflection in the window above the sink, a pale ghost with blood splattered across her sleeves, was foreign and terrifying. But there was no time for nauseous reflection. There was only time to act. As the panic lessened, just enough for her to think, Virginia devised a plan. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even rational. But it was the only plan she could think of. She couldn't just leave Richard there. Someone would find him. Someone would start asking questions. She had to get rid of the body. Her thoughts drifted to Travis Mooney, a man she knew had done things for people who didn't want to deal with the police. She had met Travis years ago through her brother, and though she barely knew him personally, she knew just enough about his side gigs to realize he might help her, if the price was right. Hesitation gripped her. Could she really involve someone like that? Bring another person into this nightmare? But when she glanced back at Richard's body, sprawled across the floor with his lifeless arms bent at sickening angles, the choice seemed clear. She had to. Grabbing her phone with shaking fingers, Virginia dialed Travis's number, a number she had stored in her contacts but never expected to use. Her hands trembled against the screen as the line rang, each second dragging like hours. Finally, a gruff voice answered, laced with suspicion. "Yeah, who the hell's calling me this late?" "It's Virginia," she stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Travis Mooney, we've met before." There was a pause on the other end. "Virginia, Ginny, what do you want? It's midnight." I need your help," Virginia choked out, feeling her knees begin to buckle under the weight of those words. I've done something I can't fix." "Whoa, slow down," Travis cut in, his tone instantly wary. "What are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "No," she snapped, the panic bubbling to the surface again. "I'm not drunk. I need you to come here. Please, Travis, I'll pay you whatever. Just come now." Her desperate tone must have convinced him because after a brief silence Travis finally muttered, "All right, where are you?" "Home," she said quickly, rattling off her address, her words tripping over each other. "Please don't tell anyone, please, Travis, just come." "All right, Ginny," he said again, though his voice was tinged with suspicion. "But you better not be dragging me into anything crazy." When the line went dead, Virginia slowly lowered the phone from her ear. A new wave of nausea hit her as fresh realizations dawned. Telling Travis wasn't the end of this nightmare. It was the beginning of a much darker part of it. While she waited, she grabbed a mop and bucket from the pantry, desperate to do something to clean up the scene. But as she pressed the wet mop against the blood-soaked floor, the sight of the dark, sticky streaks only made her efforts feel pathetic. "This isn't going to work," she thought frantically. Nothing about this was going to work. By the time Travis arrived, Virginia was sitting on the couch, gripping her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. She couldn't even look him in the eye when he stepped inside, his face twisted in shock the moment he laid eyes on the body sprawled in the kitchen. "Oh, Jesus Christ, Ginny," Travis muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "What the hell did you do?" "I didn't mean to." Virginia's voice was as thin as glass. He attacked me. I fought back. I didn't mean to, but now—" No, don't tell me this," Travis said, raising a hand to stop her. "I don't want the details. God damn it, Ginny, you know this isn't something I do." "You've done other things," she pleaded desperately, her eyes welling up with tears. "You've helped people before, right? Please, Travis, please help me get this out of my house." Travis paced back and forth, dragging his hand down his face. This wasn't what he signed up for when he took odd jobs fixing shady problems for shady people. Getting rid of cars? Sure. Small-time hustling? Fine. But this was way over the line. "Ginny, you don't understand, this is serious jail time, this isn't just me helping. We're talking murder here," he hissed. "Do you even know what kind of mess you just made?" She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He could see the answer in the blank, horrified expression on her face. Travis sighed heavily, his hands on his hips as he stared down at the body. "It's gonna cost you big, Ginny, real big." Virginia nodded before he even finished the sentence. "I'll pay you. Whatever it takes, just make it go away." Dismemberment and disposal. The grim process. Under the dim yellow light of the garage, Travis stood over Richard's corpse with a look of disgust and regret etched on his weathered face. Virginia lingered in the corner, clutching her trembling arms around her body, as if holding herself together was all she could manage. The air was heavy with tension, and the stench of blood now soured by panic and sweat. Travis sighed, running a hand down his face. "Ginny, you know there's no coming back from this, right?" His voice was cold and sharp, but there was an unspoken hesitance behind it, almost as if he was still deciding whether to bolt out the door or commit to going down with her. Virginia's eyes darted to Richard's lifeless body, sprawled awkwardly on the plastic sheeting Travis had laid on the ground. She had stared at it too long. The color had drained from his once blotchy, drunken face. His arms stuck out at unnatural angles, his shirt darkened by dried blood. The sight was grotesque, but she couldn't look away. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." "Do you though?" Travis snapped, his frustration finally boiling over. He stood up straight, glaring at her. "This isn't some messy bar fight where you punch a guy and walk away. We're talking cutting up a body, Ginny. Cutting him up. That's the kind of shit people don't forget. This ain't something you wake up from and move on like it never happened." Virginia flinched. Her lips moved, but no sound came out for a moment until— "We don't have a choice." Her voice cracked, but underneath it was a quiet, terrifying resolve. "I don't have a choice." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to say it again, louder this time. "We don't have a choice. You keep saying we." But I didn't stab the guy. Travis jabbed a finger in her direction. "Don't forget that, Ginny." Virginia dropped her gaze to the floor, tears clouding her vision. Her voice wavered. "You said you'd help me, Travis. You said—" "Yeah, I said I'd help, but this—" He gestured to the bloody heap in front of him. "This ain't exactly what I signed up for." He took a long pause, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'm only doing this because I know if I don't, you'll screw it up and get yourself locked away for life. But you owe me, Ginny. Big time. You hear me? This ain't charity." She nodded. "I'll pay you. Whatever it takes. Just please, help me." Travis knelt down next to Richard's body, examining it with a grimace. "All right," he muttered, half to himself. "It'll take all night to do this right. We mess this up and we're both screwed." His voice lacked its usual cavalier tone, replaced by an edge of dread. Virginia stood frozen in the corner, watching as Travis opened a weather-beaten toolbox he'd dragged in from his truck. He pulled out a saw, a heavy-duty pair of gloves, and a couple of tarps. The tools looked almost mundane, like something you'd use for home repairs. But tonight, their purpose was far darker. "You got stomach enough to stay and help?" Travis asked without looking up. Virginia's eyes widened in panic. I don't think I can—" "You don't think you can?" Travis snapped, throwing her a hard glare. "This ain't the time to be delicate, Ginny. You got us into this, so pick up a damn corner of this tarp, or get the hell out of here so I can work." Her legs shook as she reluctantly stepped forward. Every part of her screamed to run, to hide, to pretend this nightmare wasn't real. But where would she go? Who would take her in after this? She knelt clumsily beside Travis, avoiding looking directly at Richard's lifeless face. "All right," he said with a grim determination. "Let's start with the arms. They're small enough to—" Please don't! Virginia blurted, her hands flying up involuntarily. Travis froze, his jaw tightening. Look, Ginny, this ain't something I enjoy either, all right? But if you're gonna keep crying and screaming, you're gonna draw attention we can't afford right now. Keep it together or get out. Your call. Virginia pressed her hands over her mouth, blocking the sob rising in her throat. All she could do was nod. Travis muttered something under his breath and set to work. The first stroke of the saw sent a sickening jolt through Virginia's entire body. It was a sound she would never forget. That bone-deep grinding and snapping echoed in her ears long after it stopped. She turned her face away, staring at the damp concrete floor as her body quivered uncontrollably. Travis worked mechanically, his face pale but resolute. He wrapped each part of the body carefully in plastic before placing them into heavy-duty garbage bags. The process was slow, methodical, and brutally intimate, each cut, each movement stripping away any remaining humanity from the body they were disposing of. Occasionally, Travis would grunt or curse under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. "You better remember this, Ginny," he growled at one point. "You better remember every damn detail." Virginia said nothing. She couldn't. Her mind was a whirlwind of memories and thoughts. The first time she met Richard, her wedding day, the nights she'd prayed for a way out. This wasn't the way she'd imagined it happening, but here she was, staring at black bags that once held the man she thought she'd love forever. Eventually, Travis stood, his shirt covered in dark streaks. He peeled off his gloves and threw them into one of the bags. "We're not done yet," he said flatly, walking over to the sink to wash his hands. "You're taking one of these bags. You got a car, you got gas money, and you're gonna do your part, 'cause I sure as hell ain't hauling all this myself." "What? What do I do with it?" Virginia stammered, horrified at the thought of any of it ending up in her car. "Dump the head in the calumet, sink it deep where no one's gonna find it. The rest? Take it to different bins around the south side. Don't go to just one place, spread it out, you hear me?" Virginia's stomach churned, but she nodded. She knew he wasn't giving her a choice. This was her burden too. By the time the job was done, the sun began to tint the horizon with the faintest trace of dawn. Travis stood in the garage doorway, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. He didn't say anything for a moment, exhaling clouds of smoke into the cool morning air. Finally he turned, fixing her with a haunted look. "You crossed a line tonight, Ginny," he said quietly. "There's no going back from something like this." Virginia gave no reply. She just stood there, numb, as Travis threw the last garbage bag into the bed of his truck and drove off into the breaking dawn. Her hands were empty, her house was empty, and for the first time in years, so was her soul. Discovery of a clue, the arm that surfaced at the dump. It was the muted smell of rot that first caught Henry Blanc's attention as he drove his forklift across the sprawling Southside Chicago landfill. The air at the landfill was always putrid, an infamous mixture of spoiled food, industrial chemicals, and soggy cardboard, but something about this specific stench made him wrinkle his nose a little tighter. There was a sharp, metallic edge to it, the kind of smell that clung to your nostrils for hours, long after you left work for the day. Henry stopped his rig near the massive sorting facility where black plastic bags rolled off the conveyor belt in heaps. Each bundle was intended for incineration after being combed for recyclables, but every so often, the workers came across something that made them pause. He climbed out of the forklift and called out to Juan, one of the newer employees. "Hey kid, check this out over by the east pile. Something smells awful, even for this place." Juan rubbed his gloved hands together, his breath visible in the crisp early morning air. "It always smells awful here." No, this is different," Henry muttered, motioning toward a pile of bags that seemed to glisten unnaturally under the weak sunlight. "Go closer." Juan hesitated, but the way Henry's tone shifted made him obey. Digging through the pile with his pickstick, Juan's movements were slow, reluctant. Then Henry saw it. Juan's body froze mid-motion, the stick clattering against the ground. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" Juan gasped, backing away quickly. Henry stepped closer, squinting. At first it didn't register in his mind as anything abnormal. Sticking out of the gaping corner of a burst garbage bag was what looked like wax, pale, artificial. He squatted down to get a better look, his gut twisting inside him, and then he saw the fingernails, dirty, bloodied, but unmistakably human. It wasn't wax, that was a forearm. Henry stumbled backward, cupping his mouth, bile already rising. "Call the cops," he managed to choke out to Juan, who was already fumbling for his phone with trembling hands. By the time Chicago PD arrived, the landfill was a flurry of activity. Yellow tape cordoned off a large section of the east pile, while forensic experts suited up and prepared tools to comb through the bags. The lead investigator, Detective Eleanor Pierce, adjusted her badge and stepped toward the worksite, her sensible boots crunching against the filth beneath her. She'd been on the force for nearly 2 decades, and while crime scenes never got easier, the discovery of dismembered body parts always brought a unique kind of unease to her stomach. "What do we know so far?" Pierce asked, her voice flat, professional. One of the techs glanced up from where he was photographing the arm. "Sanitation workers found it an hour ago. Looks like it slipped out of one of the black garbage bags." Pierce squatted and studied the pale arm. There was no masking the gruesome sight, the jagged edge where it had been severed, the deep bruising around the wrist. She could see faint red lines, almost like rope burns. Someone had tried to bind this person before cutting them up. "Jesus," she muttered under her breath. "Do we have anything else? No ID, no, pieces attached to this one?" The tech shook his head. "Not from this particular bag, but there are a few other trash clusters nearby we're sifting through. Could hold more." Pierce exhaled sharply and stood, taking a weary look at the scene. The towering landfill felt infinite in size. If there were more remains tucked away in this hellhole, it could take days, weeks even, to find them all. Dumpsters from several neighborhoods funneled into the Southside landfill, meaning the crime scene could lead anywhere in the city. "Start canvassing," Pierce ordered her junior detective, Marcus Green, who was hovering nearby. "Talk to whoever worked this shift over the past couple nights. I want to know when this bag got here and which truck brought it." Marcus nodded. "Got it. You think this is gang-related? Southside's no stranger to some twisted stuff, boss." Pierce frowned but didn't answer. Her instincts told her otherwise. This wasn't gang-related violence or a brawl gone too far. Gangs didn't dismember bodies with this kind of careful, intentional cruelty. They sent messages with guns, not garbage bags. And looking toward the pale hand lying lifeless on the ground, she couldn't shake the gnawing thought curling in the back of her mind. Whoever did this wasn't done hiding their secrets yet. Hours later, the landfill yielded more horrors as the day dragged on. Forensic teams unearthed 3 additional bags marked by traces of human remains. Inside one, they found a left foot gingerly wrapped in a layer of plastic wrap. In another, soaked in blood and decomposing fluids, small pieces of flesh were still embedded in the seams of the tarp. By evening, the site had turned into a media frenzy. Reporters with microphones jostled for space behind the police line while cameras zoomed in on the plastic-covered scene. The words, "potential serial killer," buzzed through every rookie on site, though no one dared say it too loudly. Detective Pierce was growing irritated, not just from the pressure mounting around her but from the lack of leads. Every sanitation worker she'd interviewed gave bleak, generic answers about the flood of bags arriving daily. Without pinpointing where the body's remains entered the system, they were fishing for a ghost. But then, late in the night, they caught their first break. A forensic assistant kneeling by one of the bags perked up, her gloved hand holding a scrap of something that vaguely resembled a receipt. "Detective Pierce!" she called out, her voice strained. Pierce hurried over. The assistant handed her the badly stained, crumpled piece of paper sealed in a plastic bag. At first, Pierce didn't understand the importance. It appeared to be a simple grocery store receipt with smudged ink, but as her eyes scanned the text, something clicked. The address printed at the bottom wasn't far from Calumet Park, known for its quiet riverside spots. If someone were attempting to dump a body discreetly, they might have passed through here. Pierce straightened, tucking the crucial piece of evidence into her pocket. She glanced out at the horizon, determination flickering behind her eyes. "Marcus," she called to her partner, her voice tense. "Yeah," he responded. "Pull up every sanitation department route within a 10-mile radius of Calumet Park. We'll hit the ground running first thing tomorrow. If they left a receipt, maybe they left something else behind." What the cops didn't know yet, what they couldn't know, was that the discovery of one arm was just the beginning. The killer had tried to hide their crime, but secrets buried in trash don't always stay buried. A complex case, the race to catch the killer. Detective Eleanor Pierce had worked tough cases before. She had faced the thick of Chicago's most brutal crimes, domestic homicides, gang warfare, and even occasional serial offenders whose evasion skills rivaled veteran criminals. But there was something about this case that sank its teeth into her and refused to let go. It wasn't just the dismembered body found in the landfill. It wasn't even the methodical and deliberate nature of the disposal. What gnawed at her was the unsettling degree of calculated control that the killer seemed to possess. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy. Whoever did this had planned it, carried out the grisly work and then tried to erase it without leaving a trace. Or so they thought. Now, as Pierce sat in her cramped office at the Chicago PD precinct, flipping through stacks of evidence reports and half-hearted witness statements piled on her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that the killer had slipped through their fingers already. Detective Marcus Green entered the office briskly, balancing 2 styrofoam cups of lukewarm coffee. He set one down in front of Pierce with a grunt. "Figured you'd need this." Pierce smirked wearily, taking the coffee without looking up. "You know me too well, Marcus. Got anything?" "Maybe." Marcus plopped into the chair opposite her and set down a folder brimming with hastily written notes. "The sanitation truck schedules came back from last week. Turns out the route that led to the landfill cuts through about 6 neighborhoods in southwest Chicago. Narrowing it down's been a pain in the ass, but—" He paused for dramatic effect, sliding a sheet of paper toward her. "We think we found the truck that brought in the bag, or at least that arm." Pierce raised an eyebrow, scanning the sheet. It was a manifest of residential pickups and drop-offs from various alleys. Highlighted in bold were addresses near the neighborhood surrounding Calumet Park. One in particular caught her eye, a series of pickup spots clustered in a tighter radius near a strip of working-class homes and small businesses. "If the body was dumped in pieces," Pierce said, thinking aloud, "this is the most logical corridor for spreading it out." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. We cross-checked with the landfill guys for timestamps. This block, right here," he tapped one of the addresses, "is probably where our dump originated." Pierce leaned back in her chair, staring hard at the list. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. "Let's get boots on the ground," she said finally. "I want canvassing door to door. Start with the residential blocks. Anyone suspicious? Late-night movements, unfamiliar cars, something off, I want it logged. Someone knows something." Marcus chuckled wryly, sipping his coffee. "Nothing gets neighbors gossiping faster than the sight of cops pounding at doors." "Hey," Pierce muttered, "let's just hope they gossip to us." In the field, dead ends, and new suspicions. By early the next morning, Pierce and Green hit the streets with a swarm of uniformed officers canvassing the neighborhoods. The air was heavy with autumn's crisp chill, the kind that clung to your skin and forced you to pull your jacket tighter around your body. Residents, as expected, peeked from cracked windows and stood awkwardly on doorsteps as officers asked questions. At one particularly run-down duplex on Pulaski Street, Pierce questioned an older woman by the name of Lorraine Dwyer, who was chain-smoking in her bathrobe. "So, you're saying you heard something the night of the 4th?" Pierce asked, jotting notes in her black notebook. Lorraine squinted through a puff of smoke. "Yeah, I was out back letting my dog go. Heard some clunking noises coming from the alley. I thought it was just the trash guys, but it was a little too late for them. Usually they hit us early morning, you know?" "Clunking like what? Metal?" "Yeah, I think it was metal. Real loud, kind of banging. Whatever it was didn't last long, though. When I peeked out over the fence I couldn't see anything. Shadowy as hell in this alley at night." Pierce glanced at Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod. It wasn't much, but it added to the timeline. Someone was definitely out there in the dead of night, and they weren't in the alley for a casual stroll. As the hours dragged on, however, frustration mounted. Most residents either claimed they saw nothing or avoided the cops altogether, suspicious of potential retaliation. The few surveillance cameras in the area were either broken or poorly angled, capturing nothing useful. By the early afternoon, Marcus was visibly irritated. He leaned against the side of their unmarked police cruiser, shaking his head while Pierce flipped aimlessly through her notebook. "We're chasing our damn tails here," he grumbled. "What are we even looking for, boss? Ghosts? A trail this cold? I wouldn't be surprised if the killer skipped town." Pierce didn't answer. She stared across the street at a vacant lot, her mind circling through possibilities. If I were trying to get rid of a body, where would I go? What would I do next? Her reverie was broken when one of the uniformed officers jogged up to them, slightly out of breath. "Detectives!" the officer called. "We might have something. Not so much a witness, but, there's a guy around here people keep mentioning. Shady type, lowlife, apparently runs small hustles, cleans garages and storage units, sometimes without asking too many questions." Pierce raised an eyebrow, closing her notebook. "Name?" The officer looked down at the slip of paper in his hand. "Travis Mooney. Couple of residents said they've seen him driving around late nights. Beat-up truck, kind of suspicious. One lady swears she saw him hauling big tarps out of his truck the other day, but she didn't think much of it at the time." "Travis Mooney," Pierce repeated, the name unfamiliar. She exchanged a glance with Marcus, who was already pulling out his phone to run the guy through their system. "Where can I find him?" Digging into Travis Mooney. Within hours, the department had a rough profile on Travis, a mid-40s ex-con with a short, inconsistent work history and a weakness for quick money. He'd been arrested a decade prior for petty theft and had ties to a few small-time fixers in Southside Chicago's underworld. Pierce's gut instinct kicked in immediately. Mooney wasn't the killer, this wasn't his style, but he sure as hell fit the profile of a guy you'd call if you needed to handle dirty work. Guys like Mooney, they're cleanup crews, not masterminds, Marcus noted as they parked near the dingy trailer park where Mooney apparently lived. Pierce nodded, her jaw tightening. Yeah, but cleanup crews have loose lips when push comes to shove. As they approached the trailer, the faint sound of a radio hummed in the background, an old country song crooned faintly through the cracked window. Pierce knocked firmly on the chipped metal door, her knuckles echoing in the still air. The radio abruptly cut off. After a moment of silence, the door creaked open just far enough for a man with sunken eyes and a scruffy beard to peek out. "What's this about?" Travis asked, his voice gruff, tinged with suspicion. "Travis Mooney?" Pierce asked, flashing her badge. She didn't wait for a reply. "We need to ask you a few questions about some late-night activities near Pulaski last week. Can we come in?" Travis hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but he swung the door open. "Yeah, fine, sure, just don't mess up my place. Not that there's much to mess." As Pierce stepped inside, her eyes immediately darted around the small, cluttered space. Stacks of old newspapers, tarps folded neatly in a corner, and tools scattered across a workbench. She felt it in her gut. This man knew more than he let on. "Let's skip the games," Pierce started, locking eyes with him. "We know you've been spotted dumping things, maybe even helping someone out with discreet jobs, and right now, you're on our radar for something a hell of a lot worse than petty theft." Travis's expression didn't change, but a faint twitch in his jaw betrayed his nerves. "Talk to me," Pierce pressed, her voice cold. "Who paid you? What did they ask you to do?" Mooney didn't answer, but in that moment Pierce was certain she was getting closer to the truth. Clues from the children. It was a gray, overcast morning when Detective Eleanor Pierce and Marcus Green pulled into the driveway of an aging, split-level house just outside the city limits. The Doyle family home wasn't flashy, the kind of place you'd glance at once and immediately forget. But the peeling paint and unkempt lawn hinted at neglect, something Pierce suspected mirrored the turmoil inside the house even before Richard's murder. Today, their focus wasn't on Virginia Doyle but on the two younger lives forever tied to the tragedy: Tyler Doyle, Richard and Virginia's 21-year-old son, and Eliza Hayes, Virginia's 23-year-old daughter from her first marriage. Both had been pulled directly or indirectly into the storm brewing around the murder, but in Pierce's experience, when families fell apart this violently, everyone had a piece of the puzzle whether they realized it or not. The tension with Tyler Pierce knocked on the weather-beaten front door, and after several long moments of shuffling and muffled voices inside, the door cracked open. Tyler Doyle stood in the frame, his lanky frame hunching as if the weight of the last few days had compressed him into a shell of himself. His eyes were red, not from tears but from exhaustion, or potentially something else. "You're the cops," Tyler said flatly, his voice gravelly despite his young age. "And you're Tyler," Pierce replied evenly. She flashed her badge. "We're Detectives Pierce and Green. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your dad. What's happened in the last week?" Tyler stared at them, resentment flashing in his dark eyes, but eventually stepped aside, gesturing weakly for them to enter the house. The interior wasn't much better than the outside. Empty beer bottles cluttered the coffee table, the smell of stale cigarettes clinging to the air. "Mind if we sit?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the worn-out couch. "Whatever," Tyler muttered, folding himself into an armchair and lighting a cigarette. He didn't offer the detectives anything. He didn't care to. Pierce leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on her knees. "Tyler, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're here because your father's death is messy. The way it happened, the way his body, well, the way it was handled afterward. This is more than just a family tragedy, it's a murder investigation." He blew out a stream of smoke, his expression unreadable. "Sounds about right. Messy's a good word for Dad." "That's the part I wanted to ask you about," Pierce said, tilting her head. "What was your relationship with your dad like?" Tyler laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Relationship? I didn't have one with him, not in years. No one did. The relationship was all about him getting drunk, coming home pissed from gambling away his paycheck and making everyone else as miserable as he could. He wasn't some happy suburban dad if that's what you're fishing for." Marcus chimed in, crossing his arms. "And when was the last time you saw him? Before all this?" Tyler leaned back, crushing his cigarette into the ashtray. "Few weeks ago," he said, his voice losing the sharp edge of sarcasm. "Maybe longer. I stopped by to pick up some clothes I left here. We barely talked, just enough for him to call me a goddamn freeloader again like he always did." Pierce's eyes didn't leave him. "So, let me guess. There was a fight?" "Always was," Tyler admitted with a shrug. "Doesn't mean I killed him. If you're trying to pin this on me, good luck. I wasn't even in town when it happened." "We're not accusing anyone," Pierce said, though her voice carried the persistent undercurrent of skepticism that made Tyler tense up. "But you're his son." "His own blood. That puts you in the middle of this whether you like it or not. So if there's something you're not telling us, about him, about your mom, about what you've seen growing up, now's the time to speak up." Tyler hesitated, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Look, if you want the truth, I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner," he said quietly. "Mom's been miserable for years. Dad treated her like shit, always pushing her till there was nothing left, and Eliza hated him even more than I did." The name hung in the air, drawing a sharp glance from Pierce to Marcus. "Eliza? Your sister?" Marcus asked carefully. "She's my half-sister," Tyler corrected. "She's not Dad's kid. Never liked him. Barely stuck around the house growing up." Eliza's return. That afternoon they tracked Eliza down at a makeshift coffee shop on the south side of the city. She wasn't difficult to find. She stood out in a room with her artfully disheveled appearance and piercing blue eyes that could cut through steel. Unlike Tyler, she seemed composed, almost too composed, as she sipped her black coffee and watched Pierce and Marcus approach her table. "You must be the detectives," Eliza said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I figured you'd find me eventually." Pierce slid into the seat across from her, Marcus standing just behind with his notepad ready. "You're right, Eliza. Mind if we get straight to it?" She gave a subtle shrug. "Depends on what you're trying to get to." Pierce placed her elbows on the table and locked onto her gaze. "We're trying to piece together what happened to your mother and father. Tyler says you hated Richard, didn't even hide it." "Is that a crime now?" Eliza shot back, her voice calm but knife-sharp. "Maybe not," Pierce admitted, "but it paints a picture of someone with motive, if nothing else." Eliza smiled, though there was nothing warm about it. "Motives? You mean like years of watching my mom get treated like garbage by that man?" "Yeah, I had motives, Detective. Tyler did too. Hell, the entire block probably did. But motives don't make a killer." Marcus stepped in then, leaning forward. "You were back in town that week, weren't you? Just a few days before your stepfather ended up in pieces." Eliza's smile faltered slightly. "People noticed you," Marcus pressed. "Your mom didn't mention you were coming, but there you were, hanging around the old neighborhood. Bit of a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Eliza leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly. "I wasn't there to kill anyone, if that's what you're insinuating. I came back to make sure my mom was okay, to talk her into leaving. If I'd known she was going to do what she did, maybe I would have pushed harder, but I didn't see it coming, none of us did." "So, you're saying you had no idea it would escalate?" Pierce asked, her tone skeptical. Eliza's voice hardened. "What? You think I showed up and suddenly she snapped? No. I hated Richard, yes, but I hated what he did to my mom even more." Pierce's thoughts. As the interrogation wrapped, Pierce's mind churned, replaying every detail. Tyler was bitter but detached, someone who had long ago decided to abandon the chaos of his family. Eliza, on the other hand, was sharp and watchful, someone who didn't just run from trouble but fought against it. Each had a story. Each had a reason to despise Richard. And yet, at the heart of it all lay Virginia, a battered woman trapped between a toxic marriage and the children who had watched her suffer silently for years. The question lingered in Pierce's head as they left Eliza's table. Were these kids just bystanders, or did they push Virginia toward the edge? Evidence from the warehouse camera. The footage wasn't exactly a smoking gun. It rarely was. But as Detective Eleanor Pierce leaned closer to the computer screen inside the Chicago PD evidence analysis room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this grainy, low-resolution recording might be the thread to unravel everything. "Zoom in here," Pierce said, pointing to the timestamp on the video playback. Her voice was low but firm, the characteristic edge of determination cutting through it. "That's about 20 seconds before they pulled in. Enhance the damn contrast, Marcus." Detective Marcus Green sat at the computer, toggling with the playback software in frustration. "You keep throwing words like enhance at me as if this ancient pile of junk can magically sharpen an image, Ellie. It's not made by Hollywood." He tapped a few keys, muttering, We're lucky it even boots up. Quit complaining and just do it, Pierce snapped. She was already 2 coffees and a migraine into her day, and they needed something concrete, not excuses. Marcus sighed dramatically, but the grainy feed on the monitor jumped ahead in small increments, sharpening frame by frame. The security camera was positioned on the exterior of a dilapidated warehouse east of Calumet River, one of the many unmonitored dead zones throughout Chicago. The lot was derelict, rusted fences, busted overhead lights, and, apparently, 0 security guards. "Perfect spot for a dump job," Marcus remarked as his fingers worked the keyboard. "No one pays attention to this neighborhood unless they're looking for trouble. Or trying to get rid of it," Pierce quipped. She leaned in closer to the warped clip as the timestamp rolled into the early morning hours of September 5th. Suddenly, a ragged pickup truck entered frame, its headlights cutting through the dark like prison searchlights. The truck crept along the edge of the screen, deliberately slow, almost cautious. "There," Pierce said sharply, tapping the screen with her pen. "Pause it. Run those plates." Marcus froze the frame and backtracked to get a clearer look at the truck's rear license plate, but the camera's angle kept it slightly obscured. After a moment of fruitless toggling, he leaned back in defeat. "Can't see the full plate. Maybe the lab can take a crack at cleaning it up later, but right now, no luck." Pierce exhaled in frustration. "Fine, forget the plate. Let's focus on what we can actually see. Play it again, slower." The footage resumed at half speed. The truck backed into the lot, the brake lights briefly flaring like dull embers. Then the door swung open and a figure stepped out. "Here we go," Pierce muttered, straightening her posture. The figure in the shadows. The figure was unmistakably male. Broad shoulders, work boots, grimy jeans. He moved with a deliberate sluggishness, as if taking his time to scope the area. Even from the blurry feed there was something uneasy about the way the man carried himself. Head low, shoulders hunched, the posture of someone used to working unnoticed. "Is that Travis?" Marcus asked, squinting at the screen. Pierce studied the figure closely, tilting her head as if shifting her perspective might give her clearer insight. The man disappeared briefly to the rear of the truck, then reappeared dragging a large, shapeless tarp that sagged ominously at both ends. "There it is," Pierce said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The dragging and the dump." The footage captured the man hauling the heavy load toward the side of the warehouse. His movements were labored but not panicked. He navigated the uneven ground with the precision of someone who knew exactly where he was going. For several seconds the tarp disappeared from view, obscured by the corner of the building. Pierce frowned. "Why's the camera angled that way? Of course the actual dumping point wouldn't be in frame. Damn it." Marcus leaned forward. "Relax, take a look. He comes back." True enough, the man reappeared moments later, this time without the tarp. His hands brushed against his jeans instinctively, as if wiping off grime, or blood. He rounded back to the truck, but before climbing inside he paused briefly to look around. What caught Pierce's attention wasn't just the glance, it was the way he lingered, standing perfectly still for several seconds. "Pause," she ordered. Marcus froze the frame, which captured the man's face obscured by shadow. The next step, picking apart details. "You think he knows there's a camera?" Marcus asked, studying the frozen scene. "If he does, he's not that worried about it," Pierce replied. Her eyes locked on the figure's partially visible profile. "This guy isn't panicking. If anything, he's methodical, deliberate." She leaned back in her chair, pinching the bridge of her nose. "This kind of confidence worries me." Marcus gestured toward the screen. "It has to be the guy, the same one the neighbors said was hauling tarps. That's Travis Mooney, unless this part of town has a surplus of sketchy guys with rusty pickups and a knack for garbage bags." Pierce nodded slowly. "It's him. It has to be." Marcus stood up, stretching. "So what now? We've got about 30 seconds worth of blurry footage, a truck we can't fully track, and a guy who might have dumped blood-stained surprises into an empty parking lot, not exactly airtight." "No," Pierce admitted. "But it's enough to bring him in for questioning." She cracked her knuckles. "Let's see how confident he feels when he's staring down a badge." The investigation deepens. Later that afternoon, Pierce and Marcus stood just outside Travis Mooney's trailer, watching as uniformed officers repositioned themselves near the exits. The footage had given them reasonable doubt, and Travis's already suspicious reputation only added to their confidence. Inside, they heard the muffled sound of movement, clattering, maybe the shuffle of tools. Pierce raised her fist and knocked firmly on the door. This time she didn't ask if they could come in. She waited for Travis to appear in the doorway, his eyes darting nervously between the detectives and the officers flanking them. "What's this about?" Travis asked, failing to feign nonchalance. "The warehouse footage," Pierce shot back bluntly. "Want to explain what you were doing there last week?" "What footage?" Travis's tone sharpened. "The kind that shows you dragging a tarp into an abandoned lot at 2 in the damn morning," Marcus snapped, stepping forward. "I really hope you've got a decent story because right now we're all ears." For a moment Travis froze. His jaw twitched and Pierce caught the flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear, maybe panic. He hesitated just long enough to confirm her suspicion. He was hiding something. "I don't know what you're talking about," Travis finally said, his voice low. Pierce smiled coldly. "You're going to want to do better than that, Travis. Because trust me, we've got all the time in the world to pick this apart. If you dumped something you shouldn't have, and certain pieces of it start turning up in the wrong places, you're going to wish you'd come clean now." As Travis shifted on his feet, his gaze darting between the two detectives, Pierce felt it. Like a hunter after the scent of blood. He was cracking. Slowly, surely, Travis Mooney was about to give them what they needed. Shocking confession, the killer revealed. The interrogation room at Chicago PD wasn't designed for comfort or diplomacy. It was sterile. Gray walls, a single metal table bolted to the ground, 2 metal chairs and a fluorescent light that hummed faintly, serving as an ever-present reminder of how cold this place could be. But Detective Eleanor Pierce had always believed the room did half the work for her. Letting the suspects stew under the harsh light with nowhere to hide often started cracking their defenses long before the questioning even began. And Travis Mooney was already cracking. Slumped in the chair, he wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. His scruffy face twitched nervously, the bags under his eyes darker than they had been when they dragged him in. Across the table, Pierce and Marcus Green sat, their body language a carefully orchestrated mix of stern and casual. "You know why you're here, Travis," Pierce said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "That footage from the warehouse? It doesn't look good for you." Travis straightened a bit, his jaw tightening. "I told you, I was there for, dumping old crap, you know? Leftover stuff from a cleanup job. Tarps. Garbage." Pierce leaned forward, just enough to make him feel the weight of her stare. "Come on, Travis. We're not here because of some trash bags. We're here because every bag that you dumped is sitting in our evidence locker, and let me tell you what we found in those bags. Pieces of a man. Severed, wrapped up like leftovers in plastic. And guess what? They've all got your fingerprints on them." Travis's leg bounced nervously under the table. He shot a wary glance toward Marcus, who gave him nothing but a cold, silent stare. "Travis," Pierce continued, her tone softening just slightly, "I know you didn't do this by yourself. Guys like you, they don't start carving up bodies for fun. You were hired. You were told what to do. So, why don't you make it easier for yourself and tell us who called you to clean this up?" For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the old clock mounted on the wall. Travis's hands gripped the edges of the table like he was afraid he might fall through the floor. "You don't get it," he muttered finally, his voice hoarse. "I had no choice." Pierce raised an eyebrow. "No choice?" Travis nodded, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. She showed up. She was hysterical, crying, shaking. Said she didn't mean for it to happen." "Who?" Pierce interrupted sharply. Travis blinked at her, his lips trembling. Virginia Doyle." Pierce's grip on her pen tightened, the name slicing through the air like a blade. She glanced briefly at Marcus, who looked equally startled but maintained his composure. "You're saying Virginia Doyle called you?" Pierce asked, her voice calm but insistent. Travis nodded frantically. "Yes, I swear. She called me out of nowhere, said she was in deep shit, told me she'd pay me if I helped her make something disappear. I didn't even know what she meant at first." "But you figured it out," Marcus chimed in, his tone cutting. Travis nodded slowly, guilt and fear wrestling on his face. "Yeah, when I got there I saw him, her husband. He was already dead, stabbed, blood everywhere. She said she snapped, said he was choking her or something, and she didn't mean to do it. She kept saying it wasn't supposed to happen." Pierce leaned closer, her voice cold and deliberate. "And instead of calling the cops, you decided to help her cover it up? That's a hell of a favor, Travis. You don't strike me as the charitable type." "I didn't have a choice," he snapped, his voice rising. "She was desperate. She said no one would believe her, that everyone would think she killed him on purpose. And she's right, ain't she? No one's gonna believe a woman like her, one that's been miserable her whole life, when she says she didn't mean to stab her goddamn husband." Pierce narrowed her eyes. "So what, you cut up the body to save her ass? You really thought she'd get away with this?" Travis slumped further in the chair, his hands running through his greasy hair. I didn't think it through, all right. She was waving money at me, crying her eyes out. Said it was her one shot to keep herself out of prison and her kids from knowing what she'd done. I figured I'd just help her dump the pieces, and that'd be the end of it. The end of it? Marcus scoffed. You thought no one would find the damn arm sticking out of a garbage bag? Travis slammed his palms against the table, his voice breaking. I didn't know it weren't tied up properly. I didn't know somebody'd find it at the landfill. I panicked, okay? I figured if I kept my mouth shut, it'd all go away. Pierce leaned back in her chair, watching as Travis unraveled completely. It wasn't hard to see the truth in his trembling voice and frantic gestures. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was weak, desperate, and easily manipulated. Just the sort of person who'd get roped into something this horrifying. So walk me through it, she said coldly, crossing her arms, step by step, from the moment Virginia called you. The grim details emerge. Travis took a shuddering breath. She called me that night, late, like past midnight, said it was an emergency, told me to bring some tarps in my truck, so I went. Figured it'd just be another one of her weird jobs, you know? Like clearing out her garage or something. But when I got to her house, the whole place smelled like death. Pierce's stomach churned, but she kept her expression neutral. What happened next? She took me to the kitchen, Travis continued, his voice hollow. That's where he was, Richard. He was just lying there, bleeding all over the floor. She was freaking out, wiping her hands on her shirt, pacing back and forth. She kept saying, "You gotta help me, Travis. You gotta get rid of him." And you agreed? Marcus asked incredulously. Travis shook his head. Not at first. I told her she was crazy, told her to call the cops. But she started begging, saying she couldn't go to prison, saying he'd been beating her for years and this wasn't her fault, that it was self-defense. I don't know. I caved. So, you dismembered him right there in the house? Pierce pressed, her voice sharp. Travis winced. No way. I told her we had to move him, so we wrapped him in tarps and loaded him into my truck. Took him to my garage. That's where I did it. Used an old saw, gloves, plastic sheeting, the works. She just sat there the whole time, shaking like a leaf but not saying a word. And then? We bagged him up, Travis said, his voice faltering. I told her to get rid of 1 or 2 bags herself, just so it wasn't all on me. The rest, I dumped at the landfill and by the warehouse. Thought spreading it out would make it harder for anyone to put it together. His voice cracked. But I guess I was wrong. The moment of decision. Pierce stared hard at Travis, her mind whirring as she processed the confession. Every detail painted Virginia Doyle as a woman broken beyond repair, desperate, terrified, and unhinged. But that didn't absolve her of what she'd done, nor did it excuse Travis's part in this gruesome crime. Does Virginia know you're here? Pierce asked, her voice cold. No, Travis admitted weakly. I didn't tell her. I couldn't face her. Good, Marcus said curtly. Pierce scowled. Because wherever she is right now, she's got some explaining to do. Closing the case, and a heartbreaking verdict. The courtroom was packed as Virginia Doyle stepped inside for what would be the defining moment of her life. Rows of strangers filled the gallery, most of them staring at her with a cold kind of curiosity, some with outright disdain. Members of the media jostled near the back, scribbling in their notepads or whispering updates into smartphones. The case had captured a grim sense of fascination among the public, a brutal murder, a suspected battered wife, and the horrifying efforts to cover up decades of abuse with a single desperate knife stroke. On the defense table sat Virginia, her once sharp features now gaunt and exhausted. Her hair, once carefully kept, hung limply across her shoulders. If she had hoped for a glimmer of sympathy, it was smothered by the shadow of Richard Doyle's gruesome death, the dismemberment, and the damning confession of Travis Mooney. Detective Eleanor Pierce sat toward the back of the courtroom alongside Marcus Green, as they watched the battered family unravel before the eyes of the jury. They weren't there because they had to be. Their work was done, the evidence collected, the puzzle pieces assembled, but because cases like this embedded themselves deep under your skin. Whether they admitted it or not, they both needed closure. Virginia's defense attorney, Maria Kalinsky, rose as the judge gestured for closing arguments to begin. Kalinsky had taken on the case with fervor, positioning Virginia as the victim in an unrelenting story of domestic violence, a narrative intended to paint her not as a cold-blooded killer but as a desperate, broken woman pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Maria began, pacing smoothly before them, "we're not here to discuss whether Richard Doyle was dismembered. We know the answer to that. Horribly, tragically, yes, he was. but I ask you to step back and consider the woman sitting before you today who has lived 23 years of escalating torment under the thumb of a dangerous, abusive husband. Is she truly a murderer? Or is she a survivor who made a terrible human mistake in the face of overwhelming fear? Maria paused, making intentional eye contact with each juror. Richard Doyle was not the loving husband the prosecution wants you to believe. Testimonies have painted a crystal-clear picture of who he was, a domineering man who controlled Virginia's life, eroded her willpower, and built a home that was not a sanctuary, but a prison. So when you consider the events of September 4th, when that violence escalated to life-threatening proportions, ask yourself, did Virginia Doyle act in self-defense? Pierce leaned over to Marcus, muttering under her breath, "She's good, knows how to tug their heartstrings." Marcus nodded. But it's what hangs over everything else, the body, the dismemberment, the disposal. You can't ignore that. Virginia sat quietly with her hands folded, her head low. She hadn't spoken much during the trial, leaving her lawyer to do the work of arguing why she had taken that knife, why she had called Travis, and why the subsequent brutal mutilation had been an act of panic, not malice. The prosecution fires back. The prosecutor, Anthony Rutledge, rose next, his face hard and direct. His strategy was clear. While Virginia was certainly a woman who had endured hardship, Rutledge believed she had crossed an intentional line. "Self-defense," he said sharply, his words hanging crisply in the tense air. "That's what the defense will have you believe. That stabbing Richard Doyle wasn't premeditated, wasn't calculated. That she somehow had no choice but to bury a blade in his chest." He turned to the jury, his dark brows furrowed. "But what about everything after? Ladies and gentlemen, Virginia Doyle didn't stop when her husband hit the floor. That night she didn't pick up the phone to call for help. No. She picked up the phone and called Travis Mooney, a known small-time player in Chicago's underworld, to help transport and then mutilate Richard's body beyond recognition." He paused, pacing momentarily before the jury box. "There's no law of self-defense in this country that justifies what was done to Richard Doyle's remains. None! Virginia Doyle had choices that night, and the moment she crossed the line, moving from victim to perpetrator, she forfeited the right to ask this court to see her as anything else." Pierce glanced at Marcus. "He's not wrong," she muttered. "She didn't just stab him, she went further." Marcus shrugged slightly, leaning back in his chair. "But you've got to ask yourself, would we be sitting here if she went to the cops right away, or would she still be trapped in that damn house?" The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the room. Virginia sat frozen, her hands tightening around the table's edge as the foreperson spoke. "In the case of People versus Virginia Doyle," the foreperson said evenly but firmly, "we find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree and guilty of obstruction of justice." As the words left the foreperson's lips, Virginia visibly wilted in her seat. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery, followed by whispers from onlookers and the faint scribbling of reporters eager to file their stories. Pierce shifted in her chair, casting a sidelong glance at Marcus. "Second degree," she muttered, "a step down from first." "And still enough to bury her," Marcus replied quietly. Virginia was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, a decision that struck a delicate balance between punishing a gruesome crime and acknowledging years of abuse that had driven her to desperation. Travis's fallout. Not long after, Travis Mooney received his sentence, 20 years for his role in tampering with evidence and assisting in the disposal. Legal analysts speculated that his cooperation during the investigation had spared him a harsher punishment, but his testimony painted him as a man who knew better and acted anyway. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, he avoided reporters, his face blank and unreadable. Pierce, watching from the courtroom doors, sighed. "He buckled under pressure. Doesn't make him any less guilty." "Just another pawn," Marcus replied grimly. "A pawn in a game no one wins." The aftermath, a broken family for Tyler Doyle and Eliza Hayes. The case left them deeply fractured. Tyler refused to give interviews. When approached by reporters, he only offered a single statement, his voice steeped in bitterness. "I don't have a father anymore, and now I don't have a mother either. What's left to say?" Eliza, however, appeared on a few local news specials, her demeanor cool but her words cutting. "This has always been the story of my mom's life," she said during one interview, her voice shaking slightly. "She fought so hard to survive Richard, but in the end, surviving him destroyed her anyway." Detective Pierce reflects. Outside the courthouse on the final day of sentencing, Pierce stood beneath the shadow of the Chicago skyline. The crowd had thinned, and the media had found other places to be. Marcus approached, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. "Coffee's terrible, but seeing the way you look right now, you need it more than I do," he said with a wry smirk. Pierce accepted the cup, staring off into the distance. "You'll think I'm crazy," she began, "but part of me wonders if the system just isn't built for stories like Virginia's. It's too black and white, guilty or non-guilty. But women like her, they're all kinds of gray." Marcus nodded. "Probably. But we didn't build the system, Ellie. We just work in it." Pierce took a sip of her coffee, the liquid bitter on her tongue but grounding nonetheless. "At the end of the day, a man's dead, his wife's in prison, and those kids, they'll carry this forever. Doesn't feel like closure." Marcus clapped her on the shoulder as they turned to leave. "Closure isn't our job, partner. Justice is. Whether it's enough, that's for them to figure out." As the detectives walked back toward their unmarked car, Pierce glanced once more over her shoulder at the courthouse and the whirlwind of lives that had been irrevocably changed within its walls. There were no winners here. Only broken lives and the haunting echoes of everything left unsaid.